Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, how you doing, everybody? Happy New Year! Oh, I should have gotten some noisemakers to do this show. Happy New Year, everyone! It is, for our purposes today, Wednesday, January 1st, 2020. We've made it to 2020, election year. No more judges, as we mentioned yesterday. Of course, yesterday is in fact today. I have decided that I should go forward with pre-recording a show so that you can have New Year's content. If you are interested in waking up to do it. But I can tell you, in all likelihood, tomorrow I will not be interested in waking up to provide it to you at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. But as I understand it, I am pleased and proud to announce that Justice Putnam will be up with a brand new live show following our show. So do stay tuned, of course, as usual, for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. But particularly because he's making the effort to do a live show on New Year's Day. So kudos to him for that. I'm a loser. I'm not going to be able to do it. I probably could make it happen, but it's nice to sleep in once in a while. And there's plenty, actually a really good excuse for recording that show, this show, immediately following what was, for your purposes, yesterday's show, is that there's so much that we didn't get to yesterday, including the news story that was then unraveling as we spoke, or at least as I spoke yesterday, the ongoing attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, which of course was happening as President Trump arrived at his golf course, and he didn't turn around and go back and get a briefing in the makeshift Situation Room at Pervalago. I guess he just continued with his golf game. So we'll be looking forward to Benghazi 2.0 hearings sometime soon. The rallying cry, of course, being, instead of remember the Benghazi 4, you should be remembering the Baghdad 4 as he went golfing, when instead he should have been perhaps paying attention to international events. I will share with you the write-up that you have no doubt already seen from Mark Sumner. In case you didn't see it, the front page treated the story, at the time, now yesterday, this way. U.S. Embassy in Baghdad besieged by hundreds of protesters following end-of-year airstrikes. Yeah, it seems the situation got a little tense there in Baghdad. On Sunday, the United States conducted a series of airstrikes against sites in Iraq and Syria, supposedly under control of a Shiite militia group supported by the government of Iran. But on Tuesday morning, protesters enraged by those airstrikes, and who isn't enraged by airstrikes, surrounded the U.S. Embassy and set fire to a sentry box in a scene that might have been lifted from 1979. Dozens of protesters broke into the embassy compound itself, throwing bottles at embassy guards, while hundreds more surrounded the compound, chanting, "Down, down, USA." Sounds pretty serious there. And of course, broke into the compound. Didn't we spend more on that embassy than any other in history? Security, etc., being a factor. I thought that was interesting the way Mark put it there. The end-of-year airstrikes made it sound like the military had to use up their bombs by the end of the year, so they had to come up with a reason to have airstrikes. And I guess it wasn't acceptable for some reason to the people of Baghdad. As ABC News reports, Mark continues, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq was not in the building as the protesters encircled the area. Officials are preparing to evacuate the remaining staff. The U.S. airstrikes came after a series of rockets were launched at an Iraqi base where several U.S. soldiers and contractors were present. One contractor was killed, 4 soldiers wounded. Donald Trump placed blame for the contractor's death on Iran. Why not? And said that the missiles fired by F-15 fighter jets represented a strong response to that action. A spokesperson from the Kataib Hezbollah militia indicated that the strikes killed 25 and wounded 20 others. On Tuesday, Trump responded to the protests by again blaming Iran, which he says is orchestrating an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Iraq, while I get my 4-iron out and play a little golf. Trump also issued a warning to the government of Iraq that he expected that nation to use its forces to protect the embassy, and so notified. I don't even know what he meant by so notified. I'm notified, but I didn't see the rest of the tweet. I guess that's how he does things, right? Half an hour before the airstrikes on Sunday, the U.S. contacted the Iraqi prime minister to make him aware of the impending action. Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi responded by strongly objecting and insisting that the U.S. call off the strikes. Abdul Mahdi called the U.S. action a violation of Iraqi sovereignty and worried that it could spark a conflict with Iran. Maybe. However, the U.S. strike went ahead over his objections. It's unclear how willing Iraq is to risk its forces in a confrontation over an attack it did not endorse. It's equally unclear how Trump will react should Iraq fail to protect the U.S. embassy. Many of those now gathered outside the embassy in Baghdad are dressed in militia garb, and there seems to be little effort to control the situation. At least one member of the gathered crowd threatened to kill every single employee inside the embassy. The situation is, to say the very least, volatile. So, well, by the time the story, this reading of it airs tomorrow, I hope we have news of what happened and that it somehow gets diffused without further loss of life. But I don't know. We'll have to leave this in Donald Trump's hands, and, things aren't likely to get any better having to do that. But just wanted to note for the record that, that happened, and didn't find a way to squeeze it into Tuesday's show. So, okay, noted for the record on Wednesday's show. Also not making the reading on Tuesday. There's some later developments in the Ukraine situation, including, I happen to have the Hills report on it handy. Giuliani associate to turn over iPhone data and documents to House committee. We're talking about Lev Parnas here, as they tell us in the story here. Lev, an associate of President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, plans to turn over his iPhone data and other documents to the House Intelligence Committee, his lawyer announced Monday. Joseph Bondi, I guess one of his remaining lawyers, wrote a letter to the federal judge in his case. He started off, as I should say, by way of clarification, because it's not entirely clear here from the write-up yet, that the offer was first made to, I don't know whether it was first made to the court and then to the committee, or first to the committee and then he's petitioning in a court to enter it into evidence there. I don't really know. I don't know how I feel about the whole thing. It might be damning evidence. It might not be. I still worry in the back of my mind that Parnas is not off of Team Trump just yet, and that he plans to, release explosive sounding information. Then when everybody buys into it, he'll say, I was just kidding somehow. And you're all suckers for buying into this. And there really was no collusion, no quid pro quo, something like that. I'm worried that he reverses himself. So we proceed with caution with Lev Parnas. But here's the story. Bondi wrote a letter to the federal judge saying, and it doesn't say who is this federal judge just yet, saying that the subpoenaed records are important for the committee to corroborate the strength of Mr. Parnas's potential testimony in the impeachment inquiry. He wrote that they plan to produce the documents Tuesday, and per the judge's approval, will provide them to the committee. So I guess is this in his criminal case that these documents have been subpoenaed? We've asked the court for permission to give the contents of Lev Parnas's iPhone and other documents to be produced to the defense by DOJ tomorrow to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence for use in the impeachment inquiry, he wrote and tweeted as well. That's the contents of his tweet. The contents of his letter are embedded in his tweet. Does it make more sense to read the letter at all? It's not long. Let's see. He's writing to Judge J. Paul Oetken. Remember him? I think this is in his criminal case in the Southern District of New York. Dear Judge Oetken, yes, in the case regarding U.S. v. Lev Parnas et al., Tomorrow, the government will be producing documents seized from Mr. Parnas's home on October 9th, 2019. They give the coding stamped on the bottom of the pages here. And the complete extraction of Parnas's iPhone 11, seized from Mr. Parnas upon his arrest on October 9th, 2019, at the airport, of course, is where that took place. These materials fall within the scope of the September 30th, 2019 letter request and October 10th, 2019 subpoena of the United States House of Representatives Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in connection with the presidential impeachment inquiry. Review of these materials is essential to the committee's ability to corroborate the strength of Mr. Parnas's potential testimony. The government does not object to Mr. Parnas producing these pages of documents, subject to receiving approval from the court. At present, we do not know whether we intend to produce the entirety of the materials or a subset filtered for either privilege or relevancy. If a subset, we will inform the court and government as to what we have actually produced. Thank you for consideration of this application. In fact, respectfully submitted, Joseph Bondi, with copies to all counsel. So that's the contents of his letter. U.S. District Judge Paul Oetken, an Obama appointee, previously said he would approve and offer to share the documents with the committee, according to Bloomberg's reporting, which I have not read. The document release would come as Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has been requesting the Senate allow more witnesses and testimony in its trial of the president after the House impeached him. Speaker Nancy Pelosi has hung on to the articles of impeachment, of course, saying she won't pass them to the upper chamber until the guidelines for the trial are agreed upon. Parnas was arrested in early October on campaign finance violation charges, and the House committee subpoenaed his records the day after his arrest. He has since pleaded not guilty and is out of jail on bail. Giuliani's associate reportedly worked with the president's lawyer to find dirt on former Vice President Joe Biden and his son. The House impeachment inquiry began after the whistleblower report detailed that Trump asked the Ukrainian president to look into Biden days after withholding military aid from the country. That's the brief recap afforded to us by Justine Coleman, writing for The Hill. But just wanted to note that one for the record. And maybe we'll dive into a couple of other issues out there swirling around the impeachment and the impending trial, and some peripheral issues to go along with all of those. By the way, here's something interesting. This would make for a good pre-recorded show, kind of a look at side stories that make some sense along with headline news. Get all the pop-ups out of the way. Maybe you saw this one pop up, no pun intended, on Twitter the other day. The New York Times covering the release of some very interesting new, the new release of some old documents under the headline, How a Chase Bank Chairman Helped the Deposed Shah of Iran Enter the U.S. Perhaps, unfortunately, newly relevant on top of regular news, thanks to the situation at the embassy in Baghdad. The fateful decision in 1979 to admit Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, how does he pronounce that? Is it Pahlavi? You'd rarely hear the last name, the given last name of the Shah of Iran pronounced aloud these days. Anyway, the fateful decision to admit him prompted the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran and helped doom the Carter presidency, about which we also have many things to say. But it sounds like an interesting article, to say the least, and we'll take a look at it. And then it struck me that his last name here, the Shah's given last name, Pahlavi, P-A-H-L-A-V-I. How strangely similar that is to other surnames that pop up across the Middle East and Central Asia among the elites, like next door in Iraq. Remember the guy who, the less than trustworthy character who was the head of the Iraqi National Congress, who worked so hard to push for the invasion of Iraq, Ahmed Chalabi? And I'm just wondering if it's derived from the same source. Pahlavi, Chalabi, and Queen Noor, the now Dowager Queen of Jordan, whose name prior to becoming queen was Lisa Halaby, Halaby. And I'm wondering if that's just different English renderings of the same original last name. It could be Pahlavi, Halaby, Halaby, all pretty much the same. And I'm not, it would make some sense. I mean, obviously among this Middle Eastern elite, if they were all, which should surprise no one that they might all be interrelated in some fashion. And I think I once looked up the ancient history of that beleaguered Syrian city that we all either knew about or learned about in the news, which we, in our anglicized version of it, call Aleppo, but which I guess in the Arabic pronunciations it may have been the source of this. I mean, it's an ancient city, of course, and it was extraordinarily important in ancient days, and I guess has become something more of a backwater now. And now, of course, it's destroyed, but it wouldn't have been necessarily a backwater for Syrians. But Syria itself becomes something of a backwater, despite the fact that it's such a hot spot. But maybe only to us American-centric and Western-centric folks. But it used to have considerably more important when, of course, world events were centered around there. But Aleppo, as I recall, I should take a look at this, the Wikipedia entry for it. Did that describe it to us? But I think in Arabic it was Halep, which we've made Aleppo. But Halep, Halev, Halep, Haleb, Halabi, Hapalavi, Chalabi. I was just sort of wondering whether maybe that all originated. So any Arab linguists who want to weigh in on that one, you'd be welcome to do so. But in the meantime, let's get back to the actual story itself. How a Chase Bank chairman helped the deposed Shah of Iran enter the U.S. And of course, we all know the disastrous results of admitting him to the U.S., which might bring us back around to President Carter, which might give us an opportunity to talk a little bit about what he's been up to lately. David Kirkpatrick has written this story, published on the 29th. One late fall evening 40 years ago, a worn-out white Gulfstream II jet descended over Fort Lauderdale, Florida, carrying a regal but sickly passenger almost no one was expecting. If it was today, I would say it was Donald Trump, but it wasn't. Crowded aboard were a Republican political operative, Donald Trump, no, a retinue of Iranian military officers, 4 smelly and hyperactive dogs, I got that right, hyperactive dogs, and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the newly deposed Shah of Iran. Yet as the jet touched down, the only one waiting to receive the deposed monarch was the senior executive of Chase Manhattan Bank, which had not only lobbied the White House to admit the former Shah, but had arranged visas for his entourage, searched out private schools and mansions for his family, and helped arrange the Gulfstream to deliver him. The Eagle has landed. Joseph V. Reed Jr., the chief of staff to the bank's chairman, David Rockefeller, declared in a celebratory meeting at the bank the next morning. So David Rockefeller, as you were talking about here, and interesting. I'd love to read on with this. I wonder, well, I'll learn a lot about it because I didn't know anything about this situation. Less than 2 weeks later, on November 4th, 1979, vowing revenge for the admission of the Shah to the United States, revolutionary Iranian students seized the American embassy in Tehran and then held more than 50 Americans and Washington hostage for 444 days. The Shah's Washington's closest ally in the Persian Gulf, had fled Tehran in January 1979 in the face of a burgeoning uprising against his 38 years of iron-fisted rule. Liberals, leftists, and religious conservatives were rallying against him. Religious conservatives. You mean like in Iran, I guess. Strikes and demonstrations had shut down Tehran, and his security forces were losing control. The Shah sought refuge in America, but President Jimmy Carter, hoping to forge ties to the new government rising out of the chaos and concerned about the security of the United States Embassy in Tehran, refused him entry for the first 10 months of his exile. Even then, the White House only begrudgingly let him in for medical treatment. Now, a newly disclosed secret history from the offices of Mr. Rockefeller shows in vivid detail how Chase Manhattan Bank and its well-connected chairman worked behind the scenes to persuade the Carter administration to admit the Shah, one of the bank's most profitable clients. And I guess, that's probably the reason that we all would have imagined. It's interesting because at the time, I guess there was a case to be made for, he's deposed. There's a new government there. This sickly old man, medical treatment, that could possibly appeal to a figure like Carter. And just say, we're going to do the right thing and hope that the wrong thing doesn't happen as a result. Well, it did. For Mr. Carter, for the United States, and for the Middle East, it was an incendiary decision. The ensuing hostage crisis enabled Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini to consolidate his theocratic rule, started a 4-decade conflict between Washington and Tehran that is still roiling the region, and helped Ronald Reagan take the White House. To American policymakers, Iran became a parable about the political perils in the fall of a friendly strongman. Oh, friendly strongman. Hooray. We're friends with strongmen. Although Carter complained publicly at the time about the pressure campaign, the full behind-the-scenes story laid out in the recently disclosed documents has never been told. Mr. Rockefeller's team called the campaign Project Eagle because America, after the code name used for the Shah, which really should have been about the president, right? The eagle is landed is usually talking about the president. Anyway, exploiting clubby networks of power stretching deep into the White House, Mr. Rockefeller mobilized a phalanx of elder statesmen. They included Henry Kissinger, boo, like Purim here. We're going to blot out his name, but okay. The former Secretary of State, of course, and the chairman of a Chase advisory board. That's how that worked. John J. McCloy, the former commissioner of occupied Germany after World War II, remember we're 40 years in the past here, and an advisor to 8 presidents, as well as a future Chase chairman. A Chase executive and former CIA agent Archibald B. Roosevelt Jr., whose cousin, the CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt Jr., had orchestrated a 1953 coup to keep the Shah in power, and Richard M. Helms, former director of the CIA and former ambassador to Iran. What a network. Charles Francis, a veteran of corporate public affairs who worked for Chase at the time, brought the documents to the attention of the Times. Today's corporate campaigns are demolition derbies compared to this operation, he said. It was smooth, 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 and almost entirely invisible. Shouldn't be too proud of it, dude. Records of Project Evil, I got it right, I think. It's actually named Project Eagle, but you could easily go with my slip of the tongue, Project Evil. Okay, the records were donated to Yale by Mr. Reed, the campaign's director. But he deemed the material so potentially embarrassing to his patron that Mr. Reed, who died in 2016, stipulated that the records remain sealed until Mr. Rockefeller's death. Mr. Rockefeller died in 2017 at the age of 101. The archivists must have been like, come on already. Some of the information may embarrass others as well. The whole country, really, I think. Hawkish critics have often faulted Mr. Carter as worrying too much about human rights and thus failing to prop up the Shah. But the papers revealed that the president's special envoy to Iran had actually urged the country's generals to use as much deadly force as needed to suppress the revolt. Wow. Advising them about how to carry out a military takeover to keep the Shah in power. Important information. A spokeswoman for Mr. Carter did not respond to requests for comment. A spokesman for Mr. Carter at the time of the crisis was not immediately available. After the hostages were taken, the Carter administration worked desperately to try to free the captives, and on April 24th, 1980, authorized a rescue mission that collapsed in disaster. A helicopter crash in the desert killed 8 service members whose charred bodies were gleefully exhibited by Iranian officials. The hostage crisis doomed Mr. Carter's presidency, and the team around Mr. Rockefeller, a lifelong Republican with a dim view of Mr. Carter's dovish foreign policy, collaborated closely with the Reagan campaign in its efforts to preempt and discourage what it derisively labeled an October surprise, a pre-election release of the American hostages, the papers show. The Chase team helped the Reagan campaign gather and spread rumors about possible payoffs to win the release, a propaganda effort that Carter administration officials have said impeded talks to free the captives. So thanks very much for sabotaging that in favor of your candidate. But at least you weren't Russian. I guess we have that to go with. I had given my all to thwarting any effort by the Carter officials to pull off the long-suspected October surprise, Mr. Reed wrote in a letter to his family after the election, apparently referring to the Chase effort to track and discourage a hostage release deal. He was later named Mr. Reagan's ambassador to Morocco. What a nice payoff. Mr. Rockefeller then personally lobbied the incoming administration to ensure that its Iran policies protected the bank's financial interests. So I guess that's what was at bottom in all this. The records indicate that Mr. Rockefeller hoped for the restoration of a version of the deposed government. What a great prediction that was. He's a genius, Mr. Rockefeller. At the start of the Iranian upheaval, the papers show, Mr. Kissinger advised Mr. Rockefeller that the probable conclusion would be a sort of Bonapartist counter-revolution that rallies the pro-Western elements together with what was left of the army. Also a good prediction. Mr. Kissinger, in a recent email, acknowledged that the prediction reflects my thinking at the time, but said it was a judgment, not a policy proposal. But Mr. Rockefeller evidently continued to advocate for some form of restoration long after the Shah fled Tehran. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue with this fascinating story, but I am, as I'm reading about the actions that Rockefeller is taking in 1979, it occurs to me that we're reading the secret history of our own oligarchy, I guess. This before the age of widespread billionaireism, I guess. But presumably he's one of the richest guys in the country at this point, although he's calling on a vast network. He's not necessarily doing it all on his own. But yeah, even today's oligarchs, American oligarchs, work through networks anyway. It's just sort of interesting to watch this private interest become public policy, even if it means more or less deposing our own regime here. And the only regime change we got out of this was here in America. And I wonder exactly what did it mean for them to have both Kissinger, or not Kissinger, but him too, he joined in it, but Rockefeller and Reed to have given their all to make sure that there's no October surprise. I wonder if we'll ever find out something like totally shocking, like they somehow tipped off the Iranians to the rescue mission, or whether it was all just dumb luck, as we've been told from, since when it happened. And I have no real evidence to accuse anybody of anything else. I'm just sort of wondering how far this effort went. I mean, they did do things that they made up stories about payoffs in order to sabotage negotiations. And it seems interesting now to learn that Carter's initial instinct here was to hit back hard and to to go with a military option to try to prop up the regime as opposed to pulling out and letting the Iranians determine their own situation. But the Rockefeller and others in this scheme apparently needed very badly for the dominant narrative of Carter as dovish to stay in place so that they could win the presidential election behind Reagan, who would then, of course, cut their taxes and make them even more powerful. It's just sort of an interesting sub-theme to the story. I'll continue, though, with the write-up, and less speculation, more write-up, please. As late as December of 1980, Mr. Rockefeller personally urged the incoming Reagan administration to encourage a counter-revolution by stopping rug merchant-type bargaining for the hostages, and instead taking military action to punish Iran if the hostages were not released. He suggested occupying 3 Iranian-controlled islands in the Persian Gulf. The most likely outcome of this situation is an eventual replacement of the present fanatic Shiite Muslim government, either by a military one or a combination of the military with civilian democratic leaders, Mr. Rockefeller argued, according to his talking points for meetings with the Reagan transition team. An heir to his family's oil fortune, he worked so hard, to self-made billionaire, of course. Mr. Rockefeller styled himself a corporate statesman. Interesting turn of phrase. And personally knew many White House officials, including Mr. Carter. He had known the Shah since 1962, socializing with him in New York, Tehran, and St. Moritz in Switzerland. As Tehran's coffers swelled with oil revenues in the 1970s, Chase formed a joint venture with an Iranian state bank and earned big fees advising the national oil company. By 1979, the bank had syndicated more than $1.7 billion in loans for Iranian public projects, the equivalent of about $5.8 billion today. The Chase balance sheet held more than $360 million in loans to Iran and more than $500 million in Iranian deposits. Mr. Rockefeller often insisted that his concern for the Shah was purely about Washington's prestige and credibility. It was about the abandonment of a friend when he needed us most, he wrote in his memoirs. That's a nicer idea. His only advocacy for the Shah, Mr. Rockefeller wrote, had been in a brief aside to Mr. Carter during an unrelated White House meeting in April of 1979. I did nothing more, publicly or privately, to influence the administration's thinking. He undermined it. I didn't want to influence their thinking. I wanted to wreck it. That is what it turns out to be. That's what turns out to be the truth now. Yet the Project Eagle papers show that Mr. Rockefeller received detailed updates on the risks to Chase's holdings, and that even his aside to Mr. Carter in April had been planned out the previous day with Mr. Reed, Mr. McCloy, and Mr. Kissinger. Over lunch at the Knickerbocker Club in New York, Mr. Carter's special envoy to Tehran, General Robert E. Heiser, I don't know how he pronounces that name, I don't recall ever hearing it way back when. I was too young at the time. Heiser, Huyser. What did we say? Lunch at the Knickerbocker Club, right? Carter's special envoy to Tehran, General Heiser, told the Project Eagle team, though I'm sure he wasn't aware he was speaking to a team, that he had urged Iran's top military leaders to kill as many demonstrators as necessary to keep the Shah in power. That's nice. Thanks for sharing, dude. If shooting over the heads of demonstrators failed to disperse them, move to focusing on the chests, General Heiser said he told the Iranian generals, as though they couldn't have figured that out themselves. According to minutes of the lunch, they keep minutes at these lunches, I got stern and noisy with the military, he added, but in the end, the top general was gutless. Boo-hoo. Mr. Rockefeller had his own special envoy to try to help the Shah, by the way, Robert F. Armao, A-R-M-A-O, a Republican operative and public relations consultant who had worked for Mr. Rockefeller's brother Nelson during the former governor of New York and former vice president as well. There's no during at all. But okay, there you have it. Brother Nelson was where he came from. Mr. Aramayo became one of the Shah's closest advisors, something of a Paul Manafort of his day, I guess. And after Nelson Rockefeller died at the start of 1979, he reported to the Project Eagle team at Chase nearly every day for more than 2 years, because he needed the work. Everybody had the hope that there would be a repeat of the 1953 events, Mr. Aramayo recalled recently, referring to the American-backed coup that restored the Shah the first time he fled. He's fleeing all over the place, this Shah. When the Shah's rule became untenable at the start of 1979, the State Department first turned to David Rockefeller for help relocating the Iranian monarch in the United States. Not large enough for my very special client, Mr. Reed wrote to a Greenwich, Connecticut broker who had offered 2 estates priced at around $2 million each, or about $7.4 million today. So they're looking to house the guy. They should have put him in Mar-a-Lago. Wasn't available at the time. But okay. Not large enough. These 2 estates, I don't know whether both estates were not large enough or whether they proposed maybe the 2 states were next to one another and then knocked down the fence for a $4 million estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Anyway, but while the Shah tarried in Egypt and Morocco, an Iranian mob briefly seized the American embassy in February. Diplomats warned that admitting the Shah risked another assault, and Mr. Carter changed his mind about offering haven. Mr. Rockefeller refused to deliver this bad news to the Shah, afraid that it would hurt the bank by alienating a prized client. Wow. He's a real snowflake, this Shah. The risks were too high relating to the CMB, Chase Manhattan Bank, position in Iran, he responded, according to the records. Instead, Mr. Rockefeller scrambled to find accommodations elsewhere, first in the Bahamas and then in Mexico, while strategizing with Mr. Kissinger, Mr. McCloy, and others about how to persuade the White House to let in the Shah. During the 3-day push in April, Mr. Kissinger made a personal appeal to the National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Thankfully, we actually know how to pronounce his name. And a follow-up phone call to Mr. Carter. Mr. Rockefeller buttonholed the president at the White House. Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course, father of Mika Brzezinski of Morning Joe fame. These days, the players never change. Anyway, in a speech, Mr. Kissinger publicly accused the Carter administration of forcing a loyal ally to sail the world in search of refuge, like a Flying Dutchman looking for a port of call, or as the Ukrainians left twisting in the wind in front of the Russian assault these days. But gee whiz, the strong American foreign policy team seems to have switched sides. Anyway, the seed of what became a Who Lost Iran campaign theme for the Republicans. Where were we? Mr. McCoy flooded the White House with lengthy letters to senior officials, often arguing about the danger of demoralizing other friendly sovereigns. Dear Zbig, really? Did you just go by Zbig? Dear Zbig, he addressed his old friend, Mr. Brzezinski. Finally, in October, Mr. Reed sent his personal doctor to, Cuernavaca, I guess, or perhaps Cuernavaca, Mexico, to take a look-see at the Shah. Let's have a little look-see at you there, sir. He had been hiding a cancer diagnosis. The doctor, Benjamin H. Kane, or perhaps Keane, K-E-A-N, unless he's like the New Jersey Governor Kane, determined that the Shah needed sophisticated treatment within a few weeks. In Mexico, if necessary, Dr. Keane later said he had concluded. But when Mr. Reed put the doctor in touch with the State Department officials, they came away with a different prognosis, that the Shah was at the point of death, and that only a New York hospital was capable of possibly saving his life, as Mr. Carter described it at the time to the New York Times. With that opening, the Chase team began preparing the flight to Fort Lauderdale. When I told the customs man who the principal was, he almost fainted. The waiting executive, Eugene Swansea, reported the next morning. I wouldn't faint, but okay. The plane's bathroom was malfunctioning. Now, that would have me fainting. The Shah and his wife hunted in vain for a missing video cassette to finish a movie. Heavens, my word, what chaos there was on this plane. And their 4 dogs, a poodle, a collie, a cocker spaniel, and a Great Dane, walked into a bar, really, is how that should end. But they jumped on everyone. Boy, oh boy, it's just really crazy in there. The Great Dane hadn't been washed in weeks, Mr. Swansea said. The aroma was just terrible. That is bad. When Mr. Reed met the plane on its final arrival in New York, he recalled the next day, the Shah seemed to be thinking, "At last, I am getting into competent hands." But as he checked the Shah into New York Hospital, Mr. Reed was circumspect. "I am the unidentified American," he told the inquisitive staff. Well, okay. I guess he just didn't want to be identified. I want to be identified as the unidentified American in the news story about this. Mr. Reed, Mr. Rockefeller, and Mr. Kissinger met again 3 days after the hostages were taken. Noted was the feeling of indignation as being high and nothing useful to say, read the minutes. That's some stilted language. The White House said the Shah had to depart as soon as possible, but Project Eagle continued. The ideal place for the Eagle to land, Mr. Reed wrote to Mr. Armao on November 9th, forwarding a brochure from a 350-acre Hudson Valley estate. How nice. A week later, Mr. Rockefeller personally urged Mr. Carter in a phone call to direct the Secretary of State to meet with the Shah about the current situation, enclosed in quotes. Mr. Carter did not, and the Shah soon departed for Panama and then Egypt. Only after the death of the Shah on July 27, 1980, 9 months after his landing in Fort Lauderdale, did the Project Eagle team shift to new objectives. One was protecting Mr. Rockefeller from blame for the crisis. Over roast loin of veal, of course it would be veal, and vintage wine at the exclusive River Club in New York, because the Knickerbocker Club is too lame, Mr. Rockefeller and 9 others on the team gathered on August 19th. Amid discussion of a laudatory biography of the Shah by a Berkeley professor that the team had commissioned, some warned that a Rockefeller link to the embassy seizure would be hard to escape. Why was the Shah admitted? Medical treatment /DR recommended, one said, using Mr. Rockefeller's initials according to minutes of the dinner. This association cannot be ignored. So, okay, that's their notes on why was the Shah admitted. He needed medical treatment because DR, David Rockefeller, recommended he be admitted. But Mr. Kissinger was reassuring. Congress would never hold an investigation during an election campaign. Okay. Old school, huh? "I don't think we are in trouble anymore, David," Mr. Kissinger told him, but I'm sure it was harder to understand. "I don't think we are in trouble anymore, David. All right. Okay, good. I don't remember his accent exactly, but he was always a little harder to understand than what I just read out. The hostages were released on Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1981, and a few days later, Mr. Carter's departing White House counsel called Mr. Rockefeller to inquire about how the release deal affected Chase Bank. Why? "Worked out very well," Mr. Rockefeller told him, according to his records, "far better than we had feared." Well, that's the end of the weird story of oligarch David Rockefeller's involvement in the Iran hostage crisis, and how that changed our future here in America, resulting in the election of Ronald Reagan, who, of course, disastrously ushered in the era of reckless tax cuts that would eventually ruin the balance sheets here in America and undermine all of the great society efforts to try and uplift the poor in the country, and setting things on their head and laying the groundwork for further Nixonian mischief in later on in his own administration, of course, in the George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush administrations, and now, as we discussed yesterday, here stuck with Donald Trump. I thought that was all very interesting. It also, of course, brought to mind what Jimmy Carter has been up to lately, and I've been thinking a little bit about that, and actually, maybe I can roll back into my own Twitter feed to find some of that, because I was tweeting over the last weekend a little bit about that, as it struck me one morning exactly where we were sitting as the president, the current so-called president of the United States, was rage tweeting about something or other, and just sort of struck me that once again he was being a complete lunatic, and we were just sort of what are you going to do about it, right? We just have to live with the fact that he's a loon, and he's just kind of like that. That's just Trump being Trump, and we're sort of numb to that now. But I was recalling that a while ago, not that long ago, I guess, Jimmy Carter had been asked about, Trump's presidency, and had said outright, as I recall, that Trump wasn't legitimately elected, right? I mean, let me find that, because I Googled it a little bit afterwards. I started talking about it. But, Jimmy Carter and Trump, and he was saying, not legitimate. And I recall stumbling on one of those, a write-up of it. Here it is. The CNN write-up from June 28th, 2019. Former President Jimmy Carter suggested Friday, whenever that was, back in June of, what did I say, 2019? Yeah, that a full investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election would show that Donald Trump didn't win the presidency. I mean, just didn't win. It's not that he lost the popular vote and somehow pulled off the narrowest of victories thanks to the magic of the Electoral College, but he didn't win even the Electoral College vote. Something went wrong here. He says there's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election, and I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf, Carter said at the Carter Center's retreat in Leesburg, Virginia, not that far from where I am. I wish I had been there, because I would have liked to have followed up on that one, because it's unclear to me exactly what he meant. Although he is asked if he believes Trump is an illegitimate president, Carter paused for a moment, so he's not just off the cuff here. Based on what I just said, which I can't retract, and I don't know whether that meant he wanted to, Carter said to audience laughter, I guess that's it. So were you saying he's illegitimate? Well, based on what I just said, which I can't retract, I guess that's a yes. But I would love to have had the chance to follow up. Do you mean that because of a Russian propaganda campaign, people were lulled wrongly into casting their votes for him, which they wouldn't have done but for the propaganda campaign, but that they did in fact do, and therefore he squeaks by with an Electoral College win? Or are you saying that in addition to that illegal or improper influence propaganda campaign that bamboozled people, let's say, into voting for someone that they might otherwise not have voted for, in addition, was there some other interference? Did they change the results? Did they break into election computers? Is that the sort of thing we're alleging here? I'm not clear on where Jimmy Carter is on that. And that's a serious thing. Not just that he said it, but I mean, you're talking about there's he too is a duly elected president of the United States. And he says this thing. And this is what struck me. I mean, maybe I should finish up this relatively brief report of what he said that time in Leesburg, just to get as much context as we can. And then we'll move to what I was tweeting about. Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report, of course, CNN report continues, found that Russia waged a sweeping and systematic influence campaign during the 2016 election with the goal of electing Trump, but did not establish, by itself, a conspiracy between Trump's campaign and Moscow. Trump was asked to react to Carter during a Saturday news conference in Osaka, Japan. He said Carter is a Democrat and repeating a typical talking point. Trump called Carter a nice man, terrible president. So not much of an address to having been called out, right? Keep the remarks brief. Good play by Trump. Make it sound like, oh yeah, I'm just saying Carter is a loon here. But this is Trump talking. Trump defended his 2016 win, saying he worked harder and worked smarter than Hillary Clinton. Until now, the former one-term Democratic president had shared a warmer relationship with the current president, more than Trump has had with any other living president. Though he has been critical of Trump's foreign policy and accused him of deepening racial divisions, Carter has shown a willingness to help Trump. He took a phone call from Trump in April, the first time the two had spoken, to discuss U.S.-China trade negotiations. Carter also offered to travel to North Korea in order to meet with Kim Jong-un on Trump's behalf, according to a Democratic U.S. lawmaker. That probably would have been a better idea. In 2017, Carter told the New York Times that the media was harder on Trump than any other president, certainly that I've known about. And that is the end of this report. I mean, that's something Trump says about himself, too. I don't even know whether I would necessarily agree with it. But, of course, Trump has sucked worse than any other U.S. president and deserves every bit of it. Anyway, what I was really interested in was the fact that Jimmy Carter, as I tweeted on, maybe Saturday, Sunday, I can't recall. I'll show it to you. We'll share them. And share the tweet thread that ensued. Let's see. Let me isolate that one so I can put it away for you. Jimmy Carter, I had said, a duly elected president of the United States, right? And he is that. And Trump is current, but has only one term to his credit, too, in case you want to think like, oh, well, two-term presidents should be taken more seriously or something like that. No reason to believe that, but whatever. But Jimmy Carter, a duly elected president of the United States and who has a reputation for brutal honesty, even to his own detriment. We have seen that before, although he was a little cagey about what to do in Iran. We find out, according to David Rockefeller's papers, or Reed's papers, whoever that guy was. Anyway, Carter, president, reputation for honesty, says outright that Russia interfered in our elections and Donald Trump is not legitimately president. Now, on the other hand, Donald Trump, who is universally acknowledged as an inveterate liar, says it was either a 400-pound guy on a bed somewhere or Ukraine. No findings of any intelligence source support his so-called theory, which just so happens to benefit him personally, as well as those accused of interfering in the first place, the Russians. But such is our innate desire to normalize the product of our system of selecting leadership. That here we are, two alleged presidents with diametrically opposing explanations of what happened in 2016. One, honest to a fault, except for that thing about Iran, and without a personal stake in the question. The other, a liar and a known financial fraudster, suffering from advanced neurological decline, whose only chance of avoiding prison is to cling to his claims and even threaten violence so he can stay in office, and who actually paints his own face orange. Do not forget that. He's the one that's given greater weight in the media, and I just think that's weird. It's a little strange to my way of thinking, and I think probably to yours too. But just a good side note on Jimmy Carter, since we brought him up. Although I did have more to say about that subject, I didn't connect the two threads. I just, once again, reminder that he paints his face orange, and I tweeted out that picture, the most egregious example of his being unable to do this thing normally, where you can see the line where he stops painting on his skin well before his ears and before the end of the edge of his hairline, and it's just crazy. It looks like this is the photo that somebody had commented. It looked like he dipped his face in a bowl of sweet potatoes. But here we are looking at this picture of him and saying, this is the way we treat this. Like, people are like, yeah, that's makeup. Sure, we can see that. But politicians use makeup all the time when they go on TV. It's weird, but under the lights, it actually makes you look normal instead of washed out. But, this is not TV here. He's just walking around. In this case, it's just him touring Pervalago, shaking hands with people. But come on. You look at where the line is and how obvious it is. And to me, this might as well be Vermin Supreme. walking around with a boot on his head. This is that ridiculous. And we're all like, well, he just wants to look tan. But no, this is a street lunatic painting his face orange because he's out of his mind. We all pretend it's legitimate practice somehow and that that's a real attempt to look tan. But otherwise, we'd have to ask impossible questions like, are the laws he signs valid? Is Brett Kavanaugh really a member of the Supreme Court? Do we really have to do all of these things? That would be the hard question we would have to ask if we were honest about how loopy he really is or how illegitimate his presidency actually is. So we don't want to ask those questions, right? But that we'd have to wonder about that. Did we hand the nuclear button to a street corner lunatic? Or we might say, all right, he's not a street corner lunatic because he's managed to keep hold of a squalid dump like Pervalago that hasn't been consciously decorated or maintained since 1989. But okay, he's not a street lunatic and he does have this over-gilded lily of a palace. Maybe he's a Howard Hughes level lunatic instead. It's sad, really, but worse than that, we're continuing to rationalize this thing. Whereas otherwise we might say, maybe we should call the cops or protective services or something to come and collect him. I don't know, get him the help he needs. But no, we don't do that. And maybe it's because he's got Secret Service protection or whatever. So we're stuck. But maybe we should, maybe we should vote on whether or not we should do something about him or something. And then, of course, we're going to have our trial soon. Well, he has committed high crimes and misdemeanors, and if we construct a careful case, we can convince everybody that he should be removed from office. Yes, but also, he paints his face orange and maybe snorts crushed Sudafed, and we shouldn't have to go through all this trouble to restore normalcy to our country. Look at all the trouble he's putting us through, and he's just an idiot and a lunatic. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue on, and maybe we'll jump off of this ranting and raving about how crazy Donald Trump is to pick up on one of the different threads of that short rant. What about those judges? Wouldn't it be something if it really was the case that he was just not legitimately president of the United States? What the hell would we do about things? I imagine, my best guess, if you somehow came up with ironclad proof that everyone chose to believe, that in fact those 70 or 80,000 votes across the 3 states that gave him the margin he needed, allegedly, with the Electoral College hadn't in fact been cast for him, but that Russian interference at the encouragement of the Trump campaign created those votes out of thin air by hacking the system such that he would appear to have won those states and be declared president of the United States. If you found out that that was the case, and I don't know, they admit to it, whatever, just even hypothetically, what do you do at that point? Is Kavanaugh not a Supreme Court justice? Is Gorsuch not a Supreme Court justice? Or does the wall get torn down if it had been built? I don't know. All these things. Are the laws that he signed not laws? I mean, by rights, the answer to all that stuff would be yes. But how do we deal with that as a country? It occurs to me that we would be more likely to say, we're just going to have to leave it as it is, and we can reverse things the best we can from now on, and maybe the next election will remedy this, and we'll elect a new president, and it will be a very popular platform to undo everything, or maybe they would, I don't know, but would they go so far as to say, well, do we have to impeach Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and all the judges who had been confirmed to the federal bench, or are they just simply invalid as a result? How do you practically deal with this revelation? And I feel like we would come to the conclusion, others other than us. I mean, to me, I'm like, all right, we'll have to deal with that. But I think the people who actually run such things, it feels like the temptation for them to say, it's just easiest if we just leave everything in place. and try to work it out policy-wise going forward versus trying to root out what laws are now invalid and the lawsuits that would be launched as a result. And it would be a crazy scene, but how else do you really legitimately deal with these things? Anyway, that all aside, we deal with a little bit more of the reality of what's happening. I have this article that I thought you might find interesting. Mark Joseph Stern writing for Slate. What happened when Trump reshaped a powerful court? We talk an awful lot about the importance of the judges and the importance of the Supreme Court as well. I guess the preview here is the Fifth Circuit, which was already a conservative court. And I think Stern points that out, is they didn't flip the Fifth Circuit or anything, but he did cement not only a conservative majority, but a particular kind of, and I guess, again, wrong term, conservative majority, right-wing authoritarian majority. And I've got another suggested tweet thread that has been proposed for us to read here that might help explain some of that. We'll see whether we get there or not. But let's take a look at this piece here. For the Fifth Circuit, 2019 was an experiment in extreme right-wing jurisprudence. This from just after Christmas, the 26th, last week in Slate, as I mentioned. With the help of Senate Republicans, it begins, Donald Trump spent the first 3 years of his presidency remaking the federal judiciary in his own image. The president has appointed 133 district court judges, 50 appeals court judges, and 2 Supreme Court justices, meaning about 1/5 of the nation's federal trial judges and 1/4, this is now accurate, good job, 1/4 of its federal appellate judges are Trump appointees. These jurists are leading a conservative revolution that will upend decades of precedent and enshrine reactionary policies into the law. The transformation has only just begun, but for a glimpse of where the judiciary is heading if Trump wins a second term, Americans can look to the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. A traditionally conservative bench, the court has been newly reshaped by Trump and quickly got to work translating right-wing priorities into legal doctrine that will govern generations. The Fifth Circuit Court's descent into lawlessness, remember this is a court of law, did not happen by accident. Senate Republicans would not let President Barack Obama fill several seats on the court, allowing Trump to reshape it after taking office. He appointed 5 of the court's 17 active judges, who immediately allied with the court's existing far-right bloc, which includes extremists like Judges Jerry Smith and Edith Jones, appointed by Ronald Reagan, and Jennifer Walker Elrod, appointed by George W. Bush. There are now 11 GOP nominees on the court and just 5 Democratic nominees. There's also 1 vacancy because some Republican senators deem Trump's choice for the seat insufficiently militant, it is said here. Trump didn't flip the court. It had already had a majority of GOP appointees, but he neutralized the influence of moderate conservatives, if there were any. Judge Katharina Hayes, for instance, was appointed by George W. Bush, but sat near the ideological center of the court. A trio of Reagan appointees, Judges E. Grady Jolly, Patrick Higginbotham, and W. Eugene Davis. Everybody hates their first names if you're on the Fifth Circuit. They all go with initials. They leaned right, but supported judicial restraint, like conservatives used to do, and adherence to precedent. Trump's 5 appointees joined the axis of extremists like Smith, Jones, and Elrod in 2018. This year, we witnessed the results. Like all federal appeals courts, the Fifth Circuit hears cases as a 3-judge panel whose members are randomly selected. A majority of the court can then choose to rehear the case en banc, with every active judge sitting. Today, extremists are more likely to constitute a majority on 3-judge panels, and they have an insurmountable majority when the court sits en banc. In 2019, the conservative majority went on a rampage. In December, the court ruled that Obamacare's individual mandate had become unconstitutional in an overtly partisan decision, and suggested that the rest of the law may have to fall as well. And that's Trump's position, certainly. He advocates for that. Another appalling December ruling provides a good example of the Fifth Circuit's cruelty. The court granted immunity from civil suit to prison guards who locked an inmate in 2 filthy cells for 6 days. These cells, including the floor and the faucet, were covered in massive amounts, it says. Not just covered in feces, but massive amounts of feces. The inmate, who was completely naked, was forced to sleep in feces and could not eat or drink because excrement contaminated everything. He sued the guards, who laughed and taunted him as he suffered. He sued them for subjecting him to cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment, which it is. I mean, we certainly hope it's at least unusual, right? The Fifth Circuit granted the guards immunity. In Smith's opinion, the court held that an inmate's right not to be locked in a feces-covered cell for 6 days was not clearly established, so the guards could not have known they were violating the Constitution. Right? Show me in the Constitution where it says you can't put somebody in a feces-covered cell for 6 days. That's literally what they're saying. Smith added that while future guards must avoid this precise form of torture, we do not suggest that prison officials cannot require inmates to sleep naked on the floor. There can be any number of perfectly valid reasons for doing so. Like what? I guess one might ask. What they're doing here, by the way, is signaling that, oh, well, you said we couldn't put him in a feces-covered cell for 6 days. We put him in one for 7 days. You didn't say we couldn't do that, or you didn't say we couldn't use raccoon feces, or we covered everything except the 1 square inch of the leftmost, western corner of the cell with feces, and didn't say anything about that in your last ruling. To be fair, if there is such a thing, why bother? The Fifth Circuit issued a few decent decisions that did not shield law enforcement officers from lawsuits brought by victims who alleged unconstitutional conduct. This shield is called qualified immunity, by the way, he notes for us. But these modest decisions, which merely allowed victims to make their case to a jury rather than nixing their lawsuits altogether, provoked the ire of the court's far-right flank. James Ho, a Trump judge whose opinions resemble Rush Limbaugh's most incoherent rants, accused the majority of enabling mass shootings when it withheld qualified immunity from cops who apparently shot an innocent man to death. 3 bomb-throwing colleagues joined in his opinion. The facts were horrific. Officers shot the victim from 100 yards away because he was holding a toy cap gun and allegedly looked like a suspect in pursuit, probably because they were both black. When the victim didn't die immediately, the officers electrocuted him with a stun gun until he expired. According to Ho, the victim's family should not be allowed to sue the officers. In fact, Ho has suggested, joined by 2 colleagues, that no one should be able to sue the officers for constitutional violations when they engage in illegal violence. It should not be surprising that this court cut back on protections against double jeopardy, permitting prosecutions to retry a defendant on the issue of fact that a jury has already decided in his favor, or that the court curbed Americans' right to protest in a decision involving DeRay McKesson, a Black Lives Matter activist, during one demonstration that McKesson helped lead against police brutality. I mean, for us, he's more like a little bit more of a celebrity among the online folks, but I guess that's a fair enough thing. A Black Lives Matter activist. Anyway, he's a big deal. During one demonstration that McKesson helped lead against police brutality, a protester threw a hard object at an officer that hit him. The officers then sued McKesson, even though he'd done nothing to incite violence. In a shocking ruling, the Fifth Circuit approved the lawsuit, holding McKesson was liable for any violence committed by any protester at his demonstration. This decision is a frontal attack on the First Amendment, subjecting activists to crippling damages by making them liable for the conduct of people they can't actually control. It radically alters free speech law, suppressing dissent and threatening to bankrupt civil rights groups. The Fifth Circuit is also finding new and creative ways to trample LGBTQ rights. The court held that the Eighth Amendment does not require prisons to provide sex reassignment surgery to transgender inmates, even those who threaten suicide. Ho's opinion for the court willfully misgendered the trans plaintiff. The court also held that Title 7 of the Civil Rights Act does not bar discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. In a long-winded concurrence to his own majority opinion, Ho then lobbied SCOTUS to rule against LGBTQ equality, writing that a decision for LGBTQ rights would delegitimize the court. There was one bright spot on the Fifth Circuit jurisprudence in 2019, but it is an aberration that may soon be undone. Don't worry, right? A 3-judge panel refused to halt a district court's decision invalidating Mississippi's Senate District 22 as an illicit racial gerrymander under the Voting Rights Act. The panel's ruling infuriated Judge Edith Brown Clement, an arch-conservative George W. Bush appointee, who complained in partisan terms that the case hadn't come before 3 Republican judges. I'm not even sure what the hell that means. Later, a different panel upheld the district court's ruling in full. In response, Judge Don Willett, a Trump appointee, suggested that the Voting Rights Act's bar on the dilution of minority votes is unconstitutional. It appears that Clement and Willett will ultimately win out. In September, the court decided to take the case en banc, a sign that it may uphold racial gerrymandering and perhaps further hobble the Voting Rights Act. Trump's judicial nominees are not selected because they are unbiased or nonpartisan or fair-minded. They are chosen largely because of their loyalty to the Federalist Society, a network of conservative attorneys led by Leonard Leo, who advises Trump on judges. Leo has spent decades and millions in dark money grooming and vetting lawyers who impose their hard-right views from the bench. He views moderate judges like Haynes as mistakes. The influx of Trump judges who had to pass an ideological purity test to win Leo's approval will not drift to the left. The Federalist Society's influence is derived from conservative, single-minded focus on overturning Roe v. Wade. This year, the Fifth Circuit has gotten Republicans closer than ever to achieving that goal. Why can't they just get that? I mean, I don't want them to, but it's interesting that they never seem to get there. I mean, I guess they're close, though. The court has begun openly flouting Supreme Court precedent, preserving the right to choose. They kicked off the year by declining to disturb an outrageous decision by a 3-judge panel upholding Louisiana's unconstitutional abortion law. The Louisiana restriction, which forces abortion providers to get admitting privileges at nearby hospitals, is virtually identical to a Texas statute that the Supreme Court struck down in 2016. But we're in a different state, so it's okay. Yet in an opinion by Smith, the panel defied SCOTUS, which, you're not supposed to be able to do, and upheld Louisiana's law in June Medical Services versus GEE. Unless it's GEE. I don't know. I wasn't up on the case. Then in January, the court's conservative judges refused to reconsider Smith's egregious decision. Their decision so brazenly rejected binding Supreme Court precedent that Chief Justice John Roberts, no friend of reproductive rights, stepped in to keep the measure on hold. SCOTUS will hear the case in March. In October, a 3-judge panel intervened in a different case challenging a separate set of Louisiana abortion limitations. The panel declared that abortion providers lacked standing to challenge much or all of the state's abortion regime, a ploy that can insulate anti-abortion laws from judicial review altogether. The old standing trick, Armando's favorite. Imagine that. You're not allowed to sue over abortion because you're actually interested in abortion. That seems odd. Republican appointees to the Fifth Circuit make little effort to conceal their disgust with abortion. Ho accused women who terminate their pregnancies of furthering eugenics in a December concurrence. His slander of these women is not only offensive, but, of course, factually inaccurate. Ho also praised the millions of Americans who believe in the sanctity of life, insisting that Roe has no basis in constitutional text or original meaning. But feces-covered cells do, I guess. He even urged courts to hold hearings on fetal pain, writing, "If courts grant convicted murderers the right to discovery to mitigate pain from executions, there's no reason why they shouldn't be even more solicitous of innocent babies," although they can't testify. The Fifth Circuit, it's all hearsay. How do you like that? The Fifth Circuit today is a sneak peek of what more courts will look like once they have been fully captured by judges both Trump-appointed and Trump-aligned. The president has already flipped the 2nd, 3rd, and 11th circuits, creating a majority of Republican appointees. As the president solidifies his grasp on these courts, we can expect them to issue more extreme decisions that drag the law to the right. And to lose the 2nd and 3rd districts is really something, by the way. And also going to be the seat of a lot of his own legal troubles, particularly the 2nd Circuit, which covers New York. Anyway, although the Supreme Court is fiercely conservative already, the Chief Justice has stopped it short of going full partisan in occasional high-profile cases. If Trump gets one more Supreme Court appointment, however, SCOTUS may join the Fifth Circuit in abandoning any pretense of impartiality and simply embracing the Republican Party platform. Pure gimmitarian law, I would say. The Fifth Circuit is a largely successful experiment for the jurisprudence of Trumpism, and in the hands of the nation's most radically conservative judges, it has become the court where justice goes to die. A very dramatic conclusion, although I appreciate dramatic conclusions to these articles. I'm tired of reading these articles that have lots to say and that end awkwardly, so I appreciate that. Let's see. Other stories that we need to catch up on that are of importance. So let's go back to Crew again. I think at the end of yesterday's show, we discussed their finding with respect to Trump brand trademark issues in Argentina and trading them for favors by lowering tariffs on Argentina, then amazingly securing the trademarks and then re-upping the tariffs. Which is, I'm astonished that the Argentinian government hasn't tried. I don't know, maybe they tried, but they couldn't find a way, and they're bound by law and precedent to rescind those trademarks. I don't know. Or maybe they think that they can get the tariffs lowered again later. Who knows what's going on? But here's another of Crew's discovery from right around the same time. Linnea Honel, how do you pronounce this? Honel, H-O-N-O? Honel Stunkel and Lauren White. I'm sure I've butchered the names there. Both writing for the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. This story from December 18th, Trump hotel room prices spiked by 13 times last weekend. We finally know why. So this would have been earlier in December that this happened. In November. In November, we noticed a mysterious spike in the price of available rooms at Trump's D.C. hotel for a Saturday night in December. There you go. So it was the weekend that was involved was in December, but they noticed the prices spiking as early as November. The minimum cost was now 13 times the average, but we couldn't identify a reason for the spike until photos surfaced of the Trump Victory Committee's winter retreat at Trump's hotel on that exact night, which appears to have sold out much of the venue. While the least expensive room for a one-night stay at the hotel was around $500 on surrounding days, the cheapest room on December 14th was a whopping $6,719. With access to Trump, Pence, and other top officials, and a bonus invitation to the White House holiday party for donors, we no longer have to wonder why. On November 7th, Crew flagged a massive spike in the cost of a room for December 14th, suggesting that every less expensive room in the hotel was sold out, leaving only pricey suites. Presumably, rooms were taken up by donors to Trump Victory Committee, a joint fundraising committee of the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign. The exorbitant cost is even more evidence that hosting fundraisers at the Trump International Hotel is one of the best ways to sell out the notoriously empty venue, sending donor money right into Trump's pocket. Lucky donors who managed to snag a room were also invited to the White House's holiday open house, meaning that the cost of a room at Trump's D.C. hotel and donations toward his re-election included exclusive political access for the buyer. For those seeking access to the president and top members of his cabinet, the Trump Victory Committee fundraiser did not disappoint. According to 1100 Pennsylvania, what is that? I don't even know, but a blog, I guess. President Trump, Vice President Pence, and Interior Secretary David Bernhardt, what a glittering lineup, were scheduled to attend Trump's victory retreat. Vice President Pence, who is one of the more frequent visitors to Trump properties, was a special guest for lunch. Pence's lunch alone appears to have attracted 650 guests, according to a social media post that appears to have been from the event, well over the Trump Hotel's 263 rooms. Counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, who was one of the top visitors to Trump properties among executive branch officials, also participated in a Women for Trump panel. Finally, Trump and Secretary Bernhardt were slated to be special guests at the Jingle and Mingle cocktail reception and winter retreat gala. How nice. There's no question that political spending, like the Trump Victory Committee fundraiser, has helped make Trump's D.C. hotel one of the few bright spots in his financial portfolio, despite its high vacancy rate. Crew has tracked 72 political events held at Trump properties during the Trump presidency, 40 of which have been held at his D.C. hotel. Trump Victory has been a particularly loyal customer for the D.C. hotel, hosting fundraisers in June 2017, September 2018, May 2019, and June 2019. May and June. The Center for Responsive Politics found that all the political spending at the hotel is paying off, totaling nearly $20 million since the 2016 election cycle. Rate spikes like this have happened before at Trump's D.C. hotel on the 4th of July and during a Senate Republican retreat in November. But at 13 times the average rate, the Trump Victory retreat drove an unprecedented jump. Running for president typically involves raising vast sums of money for the campaign, but to be personally making millions off of a re-election effort is both unprecedented and wildly corrupt. President Trump has repeatedly claimed that the presidency has cost him business. The repeated rate jumps at his hotels surrounding political events suggest that, at least for his D.C. property, this couldn't be further from the truth. Now, I decided to run down and finish out the article before doubling back on this, but I'm not certain I understood this exactly right, or maybe I did understand it exactly right, and Crew is playing around a little bit with what's going on here. Did you catch what was going on? That on November 7th, when they finally find this, they flag a massive spike in the cost of a room on December 14th, and this is the part that concerned me, suggesting that every less expensive room in the hotel was sold out, leaving only pricey suites. Are we saying that, does this mean that they had a bunch of, admittedly expensive, $500 rooms available, but they all got booked up because there was this retreat going on, which is something you would expect to happen. The retreat's going on. It's happening at the D.C. hotel, and it's happening there because Trump plans on pocketing the money for it. Yes. And $500 a night for the hotel room is ridiculous to begin with. But it makes it sound like, well, we, like a normal hotel, or like we usually do, we have a bunch of $500 rooms, and then we have a bunch of $5,000 suites. And everybody who wanted to book a room there got to book a room there at $500 a pop, just like they normally would. And nobody booked the suite because nobody's that crazy. But that they're saying, well, did they look at the average price of what rooms were left on December 14th and then jump from that to the conclusion that Trump or somebody running his property artificially spiked the prices for regular rooms to $6,719 a night in order to soak his own donors. I mean, that was an incredible story if that's what happened. I mean, it's amazing that you could find yourself getting soaked like that and be loyal to the president for doing it to you. But I'm wondering now, as I finish reading this thing, has Crew really turned something out of nothing here? Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to Patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Let's see. Yeah, I'm a little bit, I'm still puzzled a little bit about what Crew was getting at here, but it seems like if the story is that the average price of rooms that were left on the 14th is $6,700, because the only thing that was left after the regular rooms were rented are the very expensive suites, I'm not certain that's a scandal. The scandal, such as it is of course that he is holding all of these fundraisers at his own hotel, thereby forcing his supporters to pay more money directly into his pocket. But they seem to be pleased by that for some reason, and I'm not certain why it is, but I guess they were willing to part with money to begin with to support Trump. But I guess, normally you want that money to go to the re-election campaign effort and not into the pockets of the candidate. But, this is a weird situation, and there's a mass psychosis going on, and people are somehow interested in being ripped off by Donald Trump is personally interesting to them. All right. We got a couple other things that we ought to include in our roundup for the day. We spent some time on what is now yesterday's show, reading from Greg Sargent's recap of the new revelations with respect to the documents that had been uncovered about the period during which the Ukraine aid was on hold. And let's follow it up by reading what he had to say about the developments in the fight for a, perhaps fruitless fight for a fair trial in the Senate. I like the headline. Trump is openly calling for his trial to be as corrupt as possible. What a nice headline that is. He wrote this way. One of the thorniest challenges of this moment is the difficulty of finding language adequate to capturing President Trump's actual openly stated positions. To harken back to my own rant about how obviously crazy he is and how far we go out of our way to normalize things. They are often so profoundly ridiculous and nakedly corrupt, or so audaciously saturated with bad faith, that we struggle to find ways to clearly convey what he's genuinely telling us. Case in point, Trump is now openly calling for his impeachment trial to be converted into something that is purely devoted to serving his own political needs. One that only includes witnesses that will help him keep smearing potential 2020 opponent Joe Biden, but has no meaningful relevance whatsoever to the corrupt conduct for which he has been impeached. Incredibly, this comes as Senate Republicans push for a trial that features none of the witnesses who actually do have direct knowledge of that very same corrupt conduct. Trump just made all this very explicit, and guess how he did it? He did it in a tweet. It's embedded here. It says, "The Democrats will do anything to avoid a trial in the Senate in order to protect sleepy Joe Biden and expose the millions and millions of dollars that Where's Hunter and possibly Joe were paid by companies and countries for doing nothing. Joe wants no part of this mess. I mean, that is pretty audacious. Somebody just spits out, yeah, Joe too. And what a position. Democrats don't want to have a trial. Trump is again suggesting he wants Biden to testify, and he has repeatedly called for testimony from Biden and his son Hunter, and claiming Democrats don't want a trial because they fear this outcome. This is utter nonsense. House Democrats have not sent the impeachment articles to the Senate because they first want to see what sort of procedure Trump and his GOP enablers will accept. The ones who actually fear witnesses are the Senate Republican leaders, who are refusing Democratic demands for testimony from those with the most direct knowledge of Trump's freezing of military aid to extort Ukraine into announcing an investigation of the Bidens. They are doing this to protect Trump and themselves because he's guilty as charged and they know it. Let's reiterate that Trump's deeper claim about the Bidens' alleged corruption in Ukraine has been widely debunked. This narrative holds that as vice president, Biden pushed for the ouster of a Ukrainian prosecutor to protect Hunter, who got a lucrative contract to join Ukrainian company Burisma's board and withheld loan guarantees as leverage. Here are the facts. The campaign to oust that prosecutor constituted an effort to root out corruption in Ukraine. That prosecutor was turning a blind eye to it. The push was U.S. policy widely backed by international institutions, which were also behind using loan guarantees as leverage. There was an investigation into Burisma, but Hunter Biden's role was irrelevant to that, and it was dormant by the time of Joe Biden's effort. It's fair to say that Hunter Biden shouldn't have joined Burisma. Obama administration officials worried it created the appearance that he was milking proximity to his father and selling influence over Ukraine policy. Joe Biden probably shouldn't have allowed this, though it's unclear what control he had over Hunter Biden, and it has created an aura of vague sleaze that Trump is exploiting, because boy does he love exploiting vague sleaze. But what's not in dispute is what Joe Biden himself did in Ukraine, which is at the core of Trump's false narrative. Indeed, there's a deep irony here. Biden actually did work for years to root out kleptocracy and corruption in Ukraine, explicitly describing this as essential to drawing it into the Western orbit and away from Russian predation, serving our national interests. By contrast, Trump actually does not care a whit about corruption in Ukraine. He used it as cover for extorting the Ukrainian president to help him advance his own kleptocratic and corrupt designs, subverting our national interests to his own. Perversely, Trump has been weaponizing his fake concern about Ukrainian corruption to pressure Ukraine into helping him magically transform Biden's actual efforts against Ukrainian corruption into the only, quote, real corruption of this whole saga. It's pure disinformation warfare. Let's be clear, and why not, right? This is exactly what Trump wants his impeachment trial to keep on doing. It isn't just that Trump is unrepentant about extorting a foreign power to smear a domestic rival to cheat through the next U.S. election. It's that he wants his trial to pick up that same mission where his aborted plot left off. Now, Trump might not get his way. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is privately warning against having any witnesses, fearing an unpredictable circus. Trump has confided that he gets McConnell's argument. It's unclear whether McConnell will pull that off, since he needs 51 GOP senators, and vulnerable ones might balk. But he might get those 51. If so, here's a possible game plan. Trump is calling for testimony from the Bidens to lay the groundwork for an endgame in which no witnesses testify. Trump's propaganda network will then push the narrative that not hearing from witnesses Democrats want is fair and balanced retribution, given that we're not hearing from the Bidens either. As Jonathan Chait notes, the incentives driving our media discourage them from adequately grappling with the most spectacular absurdity hiding in plain sight. The idea that Biden is vulnerable to charges of self-dealing and nepotism when Trump's presidency has instituted both of these on such a monumental scale that our system is literally incapable of dealing with them. Coverage focused on Biden's vulnerabilities obscures this absurdity from view. Similarly, the endgame I'm envisioning banks on media coverage that fails to capture the utter absurdity of Trump's trial demands. Not hearing from witnesses with direct knowledge of Trump's extortion scheme will be placed on a plane of equivalence with not hearing from the Bidens, who of course have no direct knowledge of any of that. It's all just Washington tit for tat. This, even though Trump's demand is based on a purely fabricated narrative of invented conduct that is utterly irrelevant to the corrupt conduct for which Trump is being tried. Conduct that actually did happen. And in an update, a Biden campaign spokesman, Andrew Bates, has responded to Trump's tweet. Let's see if it's worth even noting. It makes sense that Donald Trump is going into 2020 bawling like he's about to get fired. He was caught red-handed committing an unprecedented offense that no American president, not even Richard Nixon, stooped to, undermining our national security by trying to force a foreign country to lie about the political opponent he fears the most. He's also literally the most corrupt president in the history of our country. And as the vice president has said, he should finally stop breaking his promise to release his tax returns or shut up. I don't know. You tell me whether you think that was an effective response to anything. But I am glad to have had another Greg Sargent rant to add to the record here. Well worth doing. Let's see. A couple other things that we might be able to fit in our remaining time. Here's one. I just thought this was sort of interesting. I don't know exactly how I saw it. I think probably somebody retweeted it into my timeline. But I'd like to know more about this one. All I have is this tweet, which is video of what appears to be some sort of outdoor rally, protest, political gathering in Belarus. And all I've got here is the tweeter goes by the name of Roger Upchurch, Roger Upchurch 10 on as the Twitter handle there. Now Putin is trying to integrate Belarus with Russia, he claims. So tonight, a massive crowd turned out to protest Putin and Russia. This fight is worldwide. This was from December 27th. I have no further information about it. I'm looking to see whether anybody has attached any articles, but maybe we can do a little bit of searching around to find out. But what struck me, what caught my eye, of course, was Putin trying to integrate Belarus with Russia, which reminds me of how frequently we discuss the idea of maybe, there would be, how legitimate would it be for otherwise, if we assume duly elected president of the United States, to use his prerogative as a chief diplomat to actually advocate for outright political union with Russia, whether to own the globalists or not. It's not necessarily out of the question. I mean, it's a different type of situation, talking about integration with Belarus, which, of course, they have in the past been integrated with politically. It's never been the case with the United States. But just a sort of warning note out there that actual total political absorption of his neighbors is still apparently on Putin's agenda. So we'll check into that in the coming days if we can. Other stories of some interest. I think I perhaps gave a teaser for this one. Didn't make full mention of it, but Lachlan Markay has an interesting story over at the Daily Beast. Let's see. Originally published when? The 30th. So Monday. Republican telemarketer stiffed the feds out of $411,000. The Trump White House gave him a job. After all, remember, President Trump said that not paying your taxes makes him smart, right? Shannon Burns is the name of our subject here. Spent years dodging creditors and fighting off lawsuits. He found an angel at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. In the, it's a members-only article, so we'll only be able to give you the gist of it. But keep an eye out. It's just another name for the rogues gallery, I guess, here. In the final 2 months of 2016, the Trump presidential campaign paid more than $1.2 million to a small Ohio telemarketer. At the time, the company, Victory Solutions, owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Internal Revenue Service and was facing a number of lawsuits from investors. The following year, it filed for bankruptcy. Then, Trump's White House gave the company's chief executive a job. It's a jobs program, everybody. Shannon Burns is an advance associate for the White House, a part-time gig that involves preparing and managing various official presidential appearances. I work for the White House on behalf of the president, advancing his events and rallies around the nation, Burns told his Facebook friends earlier this year. I've been doing it since last year. He's also done a little bit of work for the Trump re-election campaign this year. And that's all I can tell you about it because, of course, the rest of it costs money and I'm not a subscriber to the Daily Beast, though perhaps it's something I ought to think about since we do rely on their reporting often enough. But there you go. Keep an eye out for Shannon Burns, found to be a tax cheat and rescued from bankruptcy by the tax cheat in chief in the White House. Well, that gives us some time to switch subjects a little bit and head back to Rudy Giuliani in a slightly different tack on his machinations. And I have the feeling that we're going to have to pay some closer attention to this angle in the coming days. Rudy Giuliani, Venezuela, and the Logan Act, written up by Aaron Blake at The Fix. At first glance, the Washington Post's scoop about Rudy Giuliani's maneuvering in Venezuela sounds pretty familiar, and I guess we ought to take a look at that for background information and then head back to Aaron Blake's piece. I thought that we might have more background up at the top. I have to get better versed in what he was doing. So let's skip over quickly to the Post's reporting from Rosalind Helderman, Tom Hamburger, Anthony Faiola, and Josh Dawsey from when? Look at that. Monday, December 30th. The international call, I should give you the headline, right? Trump's lawyer and the Venezuelan president, how Giuliani got involved in back-channel talks with Maduro. So many back channels for him. The international call came in to September 2018, after months of rising tension between the United States and Venezuela, a key strategic partner in South America. On one end of the line was Venezuela's socialist president, the pariah leader of a disintegrating economy, whom President Trump's administration was seeking to isolate. And even that is a little dicey in terms of the fairness of the description, but okay. On the other end, the U.S. president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and then Representative Pete Sessions of Texas, already implicated in another one of Giuliani's schemes with Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman. Both were part of a shadow diplomatic effort, backed in part by private interests, aimed at engineering a negotiated exit to ease President Nicolas Maduro from power and reopen resource-rich Venezuela to business, according to people familiar with the endeavor. Sessions had served as emissary in the back-channel effort, visiting Maduro in Caracas that spring. The phone call, which Giuliani joined, was a follow-up to that visit, Sessions' spokesman, Matt Makowiak, told the Washington Post. The phone conversation involving the Venezuelan president and Trump's personal lawyer, which has not been previously reported, provides another example of how Giuliani used his private role to insert himself into foreign diplomacy, alarming administration officials confused about whose interests he was representing. Giuliani operated a similar campaign in Ukraine this year, you may have heard a little bit about that one, where he pressured officials to announce investigations to benefit Trump, an endeavor that led to the president's impeachment this month. The impeachment inquiry pushed into the spotlight consulting work Giuliani has undertaken around the globe, even as he has been representing Trump at no charge. His freelancing has triggered concerns among White House officials that his intercessions have muddied and at times undercut official U.S. policy, according to people familiar with the worries, who, like others cited in the story, spoke on condition of anonymity to describe internal discussions. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors are scrutinizing the former New York mayor as part of an investigation into possible foreign lobbying violations. Word of Giuliani's call with Maduro eventually reached the White House officials who did not know why he was involved, according to one former senior administration official. Giuliani's willingness to talk with Maduro in late 2018 flew in the face of official policy of the White House, which, under National Security Advisor John Bolton, was then ratcheting up sanctions and taking a harder line against the Venezuelan government. Around the time of the phone call, Giuliani met with Bolton to discuss the off-the-books plan to ease Maduro from office, a plan Bolton vehemently rejected, two people familiar with the meeting said. Giuliani did not respond to multiple requests for comment. A lawyer for Bolton declined to comment. The White House did not respond to requests for comment. In January of 2019, the United States formally recognized Maduro's rival, Juan Guaido, as president, if I have that pronunciation correct, a policy move backed by Bolton. Later in the year, Giuliani would pick up a client in the region, a Venezuelan tycoon under investigation by the Justice Department for, you'll never guess what, possible money laundering. It's not clear why Giuliani became involved in the back-channel negotiations with Venezuela's president or the extent of his role. But the tale of behind-the-scenes talks with Maduro offers another example in which the president's personal attorney aligned with private interests to try to sway U.S. foreign policy. And the episode involves some of the figures who played a role in the Ukraine effort, including Sessions, an 11-term congressman who pushed for the ouster of the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine around the time he met with Giuliani associate Lev Parnas in 2018. Sessions, who lost his seat that November, is now running for Congress in another Texas district, and said through his spokesman that he has known Giuliani for 3 decades but has never worked with him on any private sector activities. When Trump took office, he promised to take a tougher stand on Maduro, who has been Venezuela's president since the 2013 death of leader Hugo Chavez and has grown increasingly repressive, even as his country has sunk into economic crisis. That approach had the backing of Republicans in Florida, which has a large and politically engaged Venezuelan and Cuban communities. Senator Marco Rubio accused then-President Barack Obama of failing to hold Maduro accountable and of naively pursuing negotiations that failed to remove him from office. Trump's personal interest in the country was piqued by a February 2017 White House visit by Lilian Tintori, the wife of a prominent Venezuelan political prisoner. She was also a former kite surfing champion who had appeared in that country's version of the reality show Survivor. Super important to somebody like Trump. Trump quickly adopted Venezuela as a cause, surprising some in the human rights community, who noted that he did not show similar interest in abuses in countries such as North Korea and Russia, but they didn't send hot chicks. That's the problem. That year, the Trump administration labeled Venezuela's vice president a drug kingpin and froze his assets in the United States. It also imposed economic sanctions on Venezuelan companies and banned travel to the United States by government officials and their families. I mean, this is interesting. We were thinking earlier about how unlikely it is for Americans to find a way to deal with having to undo an entire American administration, but we sort of do that willy-nilly with other countries. The vice president of of Venezuela is now a drug kingpin, period. We just say so. The corrupt regime destroyed a prosperous nation by imposing a failed ideology that has produced poverty and misery everywhere it has been tried, Trump declared before the UN General Assembly in September of 2017. To make matters worse, Maduro has defied his own people, stealing power from their elected representatives to preserve his disastrous rule, which is, of course, exactly what Trump is doing now, stealing power from our elected representatives to preserve his disastrous rule. But, self-awareness has never been a big thing for him. Conditions worsened in Venezuela where there were frequent shortages of basic goods, including food and medicine, runaway inflation, and spates of civil unrest. But Maduro remained in power. In February of 2018, Maduro announced that a presidential election would be held that spring, but most opposition candidates would be banned from running, leading to fears that the vote would be a sham election used to consolidate his power. U.S. business executives with interests in Venezuela, among them Harry Sargent III, the chief executive of a Florida-based global energy and shipping company who has worked extensively with the country, began encouraging negotiations to ease Maduro out of office. We're getting towards the end of the show here, and I'm thinking about maybe swapping back over to the follow-up piece, but I'm sort of scanning to see if there's any indication here that follows up on my antenna going up with the intervention in Venezuela of somebody, Harry Sargent III. I feel like, have we called his name in connection, distant connection to the Ukraine situation? He's a Florida-based global energy and shipping guy, which is, of course, what Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman were hoping to get into. They're Florida-based. They would be moving global energy, liquid natural gas, by ship to eventually to Ukraine. So now I'm curious about this stuff. I'm scrolling down a little bit, and there appears Lev Parnas's picture above a section entitled Cigar Bar Meeting. About 5 weeks after returning from Caracas, Sessions met in his capital office with Parnas, who Makowiak said wanted to discuss a proposal to sell liquefied natural gas in Ukraine. In an indictment this fall charging Parnas and his business partner Igor Fruman with illegally channeling foreign money into U.S. election campaign accounts, federal prosecutors said Parnas sought Sessions' assistance in ousting Marie Yovanovitch as ambassador to Ukraine, right, at the behest of one or more Ukrainian government officials. Maybe government officials who might okay a liquid natural gas deal, perhaps? On May 9th, the same day that Parnas posted photos of his meetings with Sessions on Facebook, the congressman sent Secretary of State Mike Pompeo a letter urging Yovanovitch's removal. Skipping down a little bit here, the spokesman says Sessions did not act at the request of Parnas, but wrote the letter after hearing concerns about the ambassador from other members of Congress, you see. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, Maduro won re-election in May with nearly 68% of the vote. The international community largely rejected the vote because of allegations of fraud and the banning of opposition parties, and civil unrest ensued as Maduro prepared to begin another term. Is there any more about the liquid natural gas issue? I don't see it so far in my scanning. This is an extensive article, and I'm wondering whether we do better to skip back than to Aaron Blake's follow-up, at least for the next couple of minutes, where he began saying, at first glance, the post-scoop about Rudy Kaluti's maneuvering in Venezuela sounds pretty familiar. He pushed the foreign government to take specific action, even as his efforts were making U.S. government officials nervous and contradicted official U.S. policy. Oh, and it turns out he had business interests in that same country. In short, it sounds a lot like Ukraine. But there is an element of this that arguably makes it more problematic, depending on what we learn moving forward. Of course, here are the bare bones of the story via the Post's Helderman, Hamburger et al., and we got the bare bones. Let's see if we can't get to his conclusion before we close things out. Giuliani's business relationship with Alejandro Betancourt Lopez is mentioned here. It was previously reported, but it takes on new significance now that we learn that Giuliani was also involved in negotiations with Maduro. As with many of Giuliani's foreign exploits, the question is whether he's using his role as Trump's personal lawyer to advance his own personal interests. But in this case, there's something else at play, because Giuliani appears to have been conducting what can be described only as diplomacy. And you might recall from the Michael Flynn saga, there is a law against doing that if you're a private citizen. In Ukraine, Giuliani was pushing for specific investigations that Trump favored and could help him politically, but he was emphasizing he was doing it only on behalf of his client, Trump, and not the government. The effort has been labeled shadow diplomacy, but it's not clear how much Giuliani might have been involved in the quid pro quos involving official U.S. government concessions. Giuliani has also represented a wealthy gold trader in Turkey with ties to top government officials and has been pushing Trump and his cabinet to take pro-Turkey action. In Venezuela, though, it's more difficult to pass this off as just working for a client. It's one thing to push for foreign investigations as a private attorney or to lobby your own government on behalf of a foreign businessman. It's another to try to negotiate a transfer of power for the leader of a country. The Logan Act, of course, prohibits individuals, non-governmental individuals, from directly or indirectly carrying on correspondence or intercourse with a foreign government or any agent thereof with the intent to influence the measures or conduct of any foreign government. In other words, conducting foreign affairs on behalf of the United States. Venezuela, definitely a country engaged in a dispute with the United States. Giuliani was arguably acting to defeat the measures of the United States by engaging in shadow diplomacy.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
We'll just sum up this paragraph here anyway, saying he was definitely engaging in a shadow diplomacy that not only contradicted official U.S. foreign policy. We know this, of course, because Bolton explicitly rejected that effort. So keep an eye out for the Logan Act coming around and biting another Trump campaign associate in the ass when he least expects it.